Kimche. You have to unmute yourself first. We've missed you. Rabbi.
That's it. I'm
That's
unmuted.
it. We're here now.
I'm unmuted, and I want to say good morning to everybody. Good morning, Michael Gross. I can see you, Michael. Good morning. Good morning, Judith. Everybody else here, those who I can see and those who I can't see. Es ha-geluyim lanu v'es she'enon geluyim lanu. Right? Some people who are visible and some people who are invisible, but even the invisible participants are very welcome. Just to remind you what we're in the middle of, probably one of the most complex but fascinating aspects of the narrative of Sefer Bereshis, which is the issue of the Eitz Hada'as, the issue of what was it really that went wrong with Adam and Chava, on account of which they were expelled from Gan Eden. What does it mean and why does the Torah tell us about it? It's actually, funnily enough, it's a topic which is very rarely studied, that we don't really often learn, because it doesn't come within the orbit of Pashta Shavua, really. First of all, Parshas Bereshis itself is very rarely dealt with in Pashta Shavua, usually just end of Sukkot, and we're busy doing other things. But the topic of the Eitz Hadas is absolutely crucial. And human reality was transformed. Before the Eitz Hadas and after the Eitz Hadas, this was a transformational moment, but it is subject to an enormous amount of misinterpretation, misreading, and misunderstanding. There's hardly anything in the Chumash which is so commonly misunderstood and misrepresented as the Eitz Hadas story. We're going to be looking at it inside in a minute. But I just want maybe I'll just start by giving you a reference that you're all familiar with. Before we even look at the text of the Chumash, we've all been at a chuppah, right? And in the chuppah, we've heard under the chuppah the Sheva Brachas, okay? In the Sheva Brachas, number 6 of the Sheva Brachas is Sameach Samach Reim U'Ahuvim. We're asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bring simcha into the lives of the young couple. And then we want to give an example of what really is the ultimate simcha that we can think of. What is the greatest quality of simcha that we can think of? Kasameichacha Yetzirecha Began Eden Mikedem. The same way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave simcha to Adam and Eve in Gan Eden, in the same way he should give simcha to this young couple. But there's a fascinating word here, and that is the word mikedem. And any offers of what does the word mikedem mean? Any offers what kedem means?
As of days of old.
As of days of old, you're quite right. So kedem comes from the Hebrew word kodem. Kodem means beforehand. And kedem means b'yemei kedem means the ancient world, right? But here it means really before. And the question is, before what? What do you mean kedem usually means, whenever we use the word kedem, there's usually an implication of a before and after reality. And we are yearning back for the before, right? So the before and after, whenever we speak about Gan Eden Mikedem, it's before the Chet, before Adam and Eve eat from the Eitz Hadas, they were in a state of what you might call bliss, right? They were a state of bliss in the sense of perfect harmony with each other, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with nature, right? With the Ratzon Hashem. Everything was really created initially. HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not create a dysfunctional world. He created a perfect world that was perfectly synchronized and harmonized in all its dimensions. And that is the ultimate bliss, began Eden Mikedem, from beforehand. From beforehand. Interestingly, we find also a similar use of the word Mikedem, just as a footnote here, nothing to do with Odom and Chava. We're soon going to have, on Sunday is Shabbos B'Tammuz, so 3 weeks' time we have Tisha B'Av, 3 weeks after that is Tisha B'Av. And we finish off Megillas Eicha by saying, Hashiveinu Hashem Elecha v'Nashuva, Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. To restore our days as they were beforehand. And what is the before or after, which is behind this pasuk, which is before and after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, right? Chadesh Yomeinu Kekedem means renew our days as they were before this disaster. Right? Eicha is about the disaster. Yirmiyah Hanavi witnessed the disaster of the Churban, and the tefillah is Chadesh Yomeinu Kekedem. That things should be renewed as they were previously. And this phrase comes back again and again in our tefillahs. Kekedem, kekedem means as they were initially in their beautiful state. So in a similar way, we say about we refer to the state of Adam and Eve, Kedem, before the Chet. So what we have to look at is, what was this Chet? What was the impact of it? And how did this event really take place? One of the most common misunderstandings, let's start from a misunderstanding, it's not a bad place to start. One of the common misunderstandings is that because the tree is called the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, a common misunderstanding, which I think has its roots possibly in more Christian Bible readings, is that actually before eating from the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve had no knowledge. In other words, they were creatures, primitive creatures without das, and they were living in a world. There is this crazy non-Jewish phrase, which is ignorance is bliss. I'm not quite sure exactly who invented this phrase, ignorance is bliss. I personally have found that ignorance is disaster usually, that the idea that ignorance is bliss tends to mean if you don't know anything about anything, you live a happy life. The more you know about things, the worse, the more difficult life becomes. Ignorance is bliss. And I think the origin of this strange aphorism comes from a misreading of Bereshis chapter 2 and 3, that before eating from the Eitz Hadas, they were living an ignorant life. They were ignorant. And then once they ate from it, and they were living a life of bliss, right? They were living a blissful life, walking around naked in paradise, right? With no problems and no guilt and no difficulties and no conflicts and nothing. And then after the Eitz Hadas, then they had knowledge, and that was a disaster. Now, if you think about, let me just review for 1 minute what we looked at last week, and you will see that that interpretation is an impossible interpretation. Because we looked last week at the fact that when Adam and Chava are put into Gan Eden, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says they're put into Gan Eden la'ovdo u'l'shomro. And we looked at the Meforshim and Chazal on that, which means that they were given mitzvahs. Ovdo and l'shomro, if you remember, the Al-Sheikh and the Midrashim say la'ovdo is mitzvahs asay and l'shomro is mitzvahs leisas. They were given mitzvahs. Many of the mitzvahs, we don't know exactly which mitzvahs they were given. The only ones we do know, I showed you last week. The Gemara in Sanhedrin learns out from Vayetzav Hashem Elokim as Adam Leimor. From that pasuk, Chazal learn out the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Okay, so there is one tradition in Chazal that they certainly minimally, the Adam and Chava had the 7 Noachide principles, right, which is God-fearing, emunah, negating paganism and basic morality. That is the 7 Noachide principles. At least that is true. There's also a mystical tradition that they had a whole Kabbalistic body of knowledge, right, which is referred to in the Torah with the words Eitz HaChaim. The Eitz HaChaim is seen to represent a body of knowledge which relates to what we would call today Kabbalistic knowledge, the Kabbalah, the mystical tradition, and there are some Sepharim which we still have today. I referred you last week to Sefer HaYetzirah, one of the more incomprehensible books of Kabbalah, which go back all the way back to Adam and Chava, which is a taste of the sort of knowledge they may have had. And indeed, in the minds of Chazal understood in the Torah that Adam and Chava, before they ate from the Eitz Hadas, had a supreme knowledge. They had a knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, an untainted knowledge, a knowledge which was pure, which was a clarity of emunah and of morality and of purpose and of nature, even of nature, because it says, Chazal make a big issue about the fact that the Pasuk relates that HaKadosh Baruch Hu asked Adam to name all the animals. The naming of the animals was understood to be not just a random, if you like, labeling the animals with random words, but actually the name of each animal in some deep way represents the essence of that animal. So Adam and Chava had not only spiritual knowledge and moral knowledge, but also moral knowledge of nature and knowledge of how the Gan Eden worked, and La'avda or L'Shamra. They had massive, pure knowledge. So it's a very interesting thing that this idea, which I think has a Christian origin, that prior to eating from the tree of knowledge, they were, if you like, simple and unknowing and living a life of ignorance, right? And then when they ate the tree of knowledge, they got knowledge. Exactly the opposite is true from the point of view of Chazal. From the point of view of Chazal, from the Torah point of view, and even without Chazal, Jewish philosophers, if you look, for example, in the famous Sefer written by the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the second chapter, in the very, very beginning of the book, Chelik Aleph Perek Beis, he raises this question. He says, I've heard people saying the most stupid thing, he says. I've heard people saying that when Adam and Chava ate from the Eitz Hadas, then they got knowledge, and before that they didn't have anything, and that's completely upside down. On the contrary, he says before, so here's the Lashon of the Rambam, which is very interesting. Before they ate from the Eitz Hadas, they had a complete grasp of the emes. The emes, the truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his relationship to the world, the truth of their relationship to each other, the truth of their relationship to nature, everything they understood completely. Right? It was only after they ate from the Eitz Hadas that, on the contrary, now listen to this carefully, that their knowledge became distorted. It became distorted by Tov V'Ra. Now, this is more of a philosophical issue that goes beyond this shiur. But really, the difference here, to understand this fully, you have to understand the difference between emes and sheker on the one hand, true and false on the one hand, as opposed to tov and ra on the other hand. Good and bad, the categories of good and bad that we use, right, are very subjective and relative. Something is good in one situation, bad in a different situation, but good at one time of life and bad at a different time of life. Good for one person, bad for a different person. Good and bad is always subjective. It's time bound, and it is personal assessment, and it's a moral intuition. But what happened is that prior to, I'm going to show you inside a few interesting commentaries on this. Prior to eating from the Eitz Hadas, they lived in a pure world of emes, the purity of truth about everything, right? And the subjectivity didn't enter into their lives at all. So the first thing I wanted to mention is that the genuine Torah perspective that we find in all of Chazal and all of the Mefarshim, bar none, is that the knowledge before eating from the tree was a supreme, perfect type of knowledge. And by eating from the tree, they distorted their knowledge, and it became now affected by all sorts of other considerations, which we will see in a minute. That is one important point I wanted to make before we even look at the texts. And now let's look at a few texts together. Let's see if I can get this out, this share screen. How are we doing? Can you see a text? Yes? Lovely. Okay, so this is the topic of today's shir, the Eitz Hada'at Tov V'Ra. That is the what we're going to see, the tree of knowledge of good or bad. And I brought you here the bracha. Sameach tsamach reim o ahuvim, k'sameircha yitzircha b'gan Eden mikedem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Gan Eden as it was in earlier times. There is actually an interesting detail here. I'll just mention you in passing, which I find fascinating. That when the Pasuk speaks about God creating Gan Eden, it says HaKadosh Baruch Hu created Gan Eden Bekedem. That was even before the Chet. That the Gan Eden was in some sense created, and that's usually translated to mean in the east, because the word Kedem has an ambiguity to it. It means east, as in north, south, east, and west. It's in the east, right? But there's also very interesting ambiguity here that in a sense, the Pasuk is, if you like, hinting at the fact that Gan Eden is not going to remain as the reality for human life going forward. Gan Eden is going to remain Mikedem, life as it was before the Chet. Okay, we'll come back to this in a minute. Let's have a look here at a few psukim. So this pasuk we looked at last week in terms of the 7 Noahide laws that the Gemara in Sanhedrin learns out from this pasuk. Vayitzav Hashem Elokim ala Adam leimar mikol eitz hagan ochel tocha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is commanding Adam and Chava that they're allowed to eat from all the fruit of the trees in Gan Eden. And even if one reflects even a little bit on this pasuk, you see straight away that Adam and Chava were able to receive the Dvar Hashem. They were able to receive the word of God, and that they were able to receive a commandment, which all implies a very high level of das, a very high level of knowledge. They were, in fact, Nevi'im. They had a certain prophetic abilities, otherwise they wouldn't have heard this commandment, right? The commandment from HaKadosh Baruch Hu came directly to Adam and Eve. And so it's clear from this pasuk, even before we get to Chazal, that Adam and Chava were the type of creatures who could hear the Tzivui Hashem, and to whom it was relevant for God to give a commandment to them. So clearly they had knowledge. Clearly there was knowledge, right? We call Eitz Hagan Ochel Tochel. It's actually interesting, it's a bit of a broader topic, but I'm just going to mention it here in passing. The way the Torah is written, when the Torah gives us a prohibition, it very often starts off with the positive. It doesn't start off by saying, on Shabbos you mustn't do any work. The Torah starts off by saying, Sheishes Yomim Taseh Melachtecha, for 6 days you could work, and then on the 7th day you don't work. Why is the Torah telling us on 6 days you can work? We know we can work on the 6 days. Why should the Torah wants to contrast it? The Torah wants to say that no, the world is there for us to live in and to be creative in and to develop the world. So it says, Sheishes Yomim Taseh Melachtecha, right? 6 days you should work. So here as well it says, from all the fruit of the tree you should eat. I mentioned last week, slightly humorously, I said it comes out from this pasuk. If somebody asks you what was the very first mitzvah that God gave to Adam and Eve, the answer is eat, which is I think it's a very Jewish phenomenon. What do you think, Elian? Do you think it's a good, it's a Jewish, a Jewish value? What's the first thing that's important? To eat, right? Eating is the first commandment that is given. If anybody asks you why do Jews eat so much, refer them to Bereshit chapter 2. The first commandment given to Adam and Eve is to eat, full stop. But also recently, I I've been learning now some Shemitah halachas. Maybe in this year I can give one or two shiurim on Shemitah as we get closer to Rosh Hashanah, right? As we're getting into Rosh Hashanah, we're getting into Shemitah. And there as well, the Torah doesn't just say on the 7th year you mustn't plow and reap and harvest. It first says, Sheish shonim tizra sodecha. For 6 years you can plow and plant and harvest and reap. So in other words, it first tells us the positive before it tells us the negative. So here it says as well, but, so here comes the first thing, but the tree which is called Da'as Tov V'Ra. And it's interesting, the Rambam is very interesting. It doesn't just say, it's not the Eitz Hadas. It's not the tree of knowledge. Knowledge they had already beforehand, right? Knowledge they had from the moment they were created. They were created with perfect knowledge of the world and how to relate to God and spiritual matters and moral matters and even the essence of nature. The name of this tree is not the Eitz Hadas. It's the Eitz Hadas Tov V'Ra. It's operating now on a new basis, not anymore the basis of da'at, of pure knowledge, but da'at combined with tov v'ra. And we're going to see in a minute that tov v'ra, good and bad, are very subjective qualities. Subjective qualities in many ways, we'll see in a minute. And here they're told you shouldn't eat from it. Most Thomas. As soon as you eat from it, you will die. And of course, that also needs a bit of explanation because they did eat from it, and of course, they didn't die straight away. So what does it mean on the day that it says, B'yom achol chomer, on the day you eat from it, you will die? And that proved to be not true. Or was it true? Or have we misunderstood this pasuk? So there are lots of interesting details here along the way we need to look at. I brought you here in Ibn Ezra. So he makes one or two of the points that I mentioned just before, but I like to see it inside. V'da. So whenever the Rishonim start off with the word v'da, they mean it's important to know. In other words, when they say v'da, this was a style of many of the Rishonim. When they started off a pasuk v'da, it means, let me give you an introduction here to this whole topic. These are the, if you like, the axioms. This is something which is fundamental to the whole story. V'da, you should know. Ki odom mole das hoyo. That the human being, from the moment he was created, was male dat. He was full of knowledge and understanding. How do I know that, says the Ibn Ezra? Ki Hashem lo yitzaver. HaKadosh Baruch Hu would not have given a commandment la asher ein lo das. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wouldn't have commanded man anything if he didn't have das, right? We know, for example, in halacha, that if somebody is for example, a koton, a child, or a shoiter, somebody who is mentally impaired, or he's just a child, that he doesn't have any das, and because he doesn't have any das, he's not obligated in mitzvahs. In other words, being obligated in mitzvahs and having das, having knowledge, having understanding, go hand in hand. It's no good giving a mitzvah to someone who has no understanding. So says the Ibn Ezra, therefore it's clear that if the HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave this tzivui, this commandment to Adam and Eve, the implication is clearly they had das, right? So what happened with the tree? Says the Ibn Ezra, rak das tov v'ra v'dova echad levado lo yoda. They didn't have the experience of tov and ra v'dova echad. What does that mean? That tov and ra are mixed together in a way that it's difficult to tell them apart. You have a decision to make, and it has certain elements which are tov, certain elements which are ra, and you can't understand, you can't grasp completely what is the real truth of it. You're trying to get to the truth. You want to act in a way, or you want to understand something in a way which is ultimately true, but the tov and the ra are very subjective and fluid and changing. And therefore, he says that they didn't have. And he brings down the proof that I mentioned to you just before. Halo tire, Look, for example, says the Ibn Ezra, Koro Shemos l'chol ha'bahemos va'of. He gave names to all the animals and birds, he told us kol echad ve'echad, according to the nature, the essence of each animal. V'hinei chacham gadol hoya. So the Ibn Ezra basically is just, I just wanted to show you that inside. Ibn Ezra, one of the great Rishonim, is making a clear point here that clearly Adam Arishan is a chacham gadol. You must understand why this is important, because the minute we understand that Adam Rishon was a Chacham Gadol, it forces us to try and understand a bit deeper what happened when he ate from the eights. What was added to him once he ate from the eights Hadas Tovara? So the Ramban is interested in this part of the phrase, B'yom acholcha mimenu mos tomus, right? On the day that you eat from this tree, you will die, right? So, but as I said, the big question on that is that he didn't die. They ate from the tree. Adam and Chava lived to be 930 years old. They didn't live. They didn't die. So the Ramban says, here's something interesting, B'eis shetocha mimenu tihye ben moves. When you eat from this tree, you will be, so ben moves, I suppose it means, a bit ambiguous, that it means that you will be sentenced to death. Not yet executed, but you will be sentenced to death. And here's an interesting question that Ramban is interested in. Does this mean, right, so here's an interesting, one of the, if you like, speculative parts of Sefer Bereshis is, what type of creature was Adam before the sin, right? So one of the interesting things is, if the pasuk says when you eat from the tree you will become subject to death, you'll become mortal, the implication is that before he ate from the Eitz Hadas, he was immortal. The implication is that before what would have been, this is one of the interesting questions in Sefer Bereshis, a question to which we can never know the answer, because one can never know the answer to what if questions, right? What if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo, would we all speak French? Okay, that's a good question. What if? Who knows, right? What would have been if we would have lost the Battle of Waterloo? What would have been if the American Revolution would have failed? What would the world look like today if America was still a colony of the British Empire? What if? There are lots of what ifs that which are simply impossible to know the answer to. And similarly in the Chumash as well, you have, what if Adam and Chava would not have eaten from the Eitz Hadas? What it would have been. And yet, many of the Mefarshim are interested in this, and the Ramban wants to know this question. Right? Does this pasuk mean that before Adam and Chava ate from the Eitz Hadas, does it mean that they were immortal? That the original plan was for man and woman to be creatures who never died. So let's have a look at this text for a minute. So he goes on to say, look at this. This is still the Ramban, okay? So the Ramban writes, "Valdas anshe hateva." This is an interesting. The Ramban sometimes quotes scientists. Now you understand he's writing in the 1200s, okay? So he's writing 800 years ago. So when he quotes scientists, they're not modern scientists, they're more like Aristotle was a scientist. But he says, if you follow the thinking of Aristotelian science, so he says they are convinced, man was destined to die from the very beginning. In other words, when man was created, he was already mortal. Why? Mipnei heyoso murkov. Murkov means because the human being is made up of a composite of all different atoms and molecules and pieces of the body and life. And nothing in life remains forever. it's all subject to growth and decay. Everything that is growing, right? Everything that grows is murkov, and therefore has a finite life. So says the Ramban, the scientists will tell you that this pasuk can't mean that if you eat from this tree, you will become mortal, because man was always mortal. So what could it mean? Avol gozar ata, it must mean shem yechte yomus pecheta, that if he does the aveira, he will be sentenced to death. Kaderech chayre mises b'dei shemayim ba'aveira is like anybody who has committed a capital offense. Okay, so that he says al da'as anshe hateva, but it's interesting that he gives credibility to the scientific, what you might call the materialistic view. But then he goes on to say, al da'as rabosenu, but Chazal have got a slightly different view. Brings a Gemara in Shabbos Nun Hey. Il mole shechoto lo meis la'olam. There is a view that Adam and Chava, if they wouldn't have done the chet, the initial idea was that death itself would have never existed for human beings. How is that possible? Surely the scientists are right. Any living organism has a finite life to it. So he says, Ki haneshama ha'elyona nasenes chayim la'at. Very beautiful line here in the Ramban. Because don't forget, he says, okay, don't forget, says the Ramban, the Adam and Chava had, in addition to a physical body created from the offer, from the dust of the earth, they also had a neshama elyona. They had within them something eternal, the eternal neshama, which we understand, which will live forever, right? Had they not eaten from the Eitz Hadas, that neshama elyona, that supreme neshama of the individual, would have had such an impact and an effect on the human body that the human body would have been transformed into a vessel for the neshama and would have lived forever like the neshama lives forever. In other words, the whole idea of human being dying and the neshama and the body separating and then coming back together afterwards, right? Right, that is the model that we are familiar with. That was not plan A. That was not plan A. That was plan B. That was the Chet Adam Harishon made it essential for this to happen. We mentioned last week something interesting. I wonder if anybody's had any further thoughts about something we mentioned last week. I asked you a question last week. What is it about the human mind and human nature, which if you give it a restriction, there is a certain thrill or a certain need to go past that restriction? So when somebody gives you I gave you the example last week of somebody puts you into a library with 50,000 fabulous books and tells you can read all of them, any of them, only not that book up there on the fourth shelf on the left-hand side. That book is forbidden. So you'll sit in the library reading, and all the time you'll be thinking in the back of your mind, I wonder what's in that book. And after a short time, you'll take it down to have a look at it. Because we have, what is it? Anybody have any thoughts on this subject? What is it about the human nature which forces us in some way to go beyond and to taste the concept of, right? There's a phrase used which comes from this whole story, to taste the forbidden fruit, right? The forbidden fruit. And there's something about the forbidden fruit, because it's forbidden, that makes it more attractive. Anybody got any offers, any thoughts on the subject? Have you seen anything along these lines? I just find it very fascinating that somehow is built into human nature. Yes, Judith.
I think there's a certain instinct in human nature to, first of all, people don't like being told what to do. They don't like being limited. People like to be free to do what they want. So as soon as you tell someone they can't do something, there's an instinct to want to rebel against that. I thought that was maybe part of
it. Yes, okay, so you say it comes from a sense of freedom, wanting to be free of limits. Right? Because don't forget, the whole idea that we have, which we're familiar with, of our lives having boundaries. There are boundaries in relationships, there are boundaries in human behavior, boundaries in society, right? The first boundary that was ever introduced into the world was the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, look, here's planet Earth. Every river, every plant, every tree, every animal, it's all yours, right? But there's one boundary, this Eitz Hadas, right? And Adam and Chava had to push back against that boundary, right? And there's something about this, incidentally, some of you might be aware of this from your own children, I certainly am, that in this particular field, teenagers are world experts at pushing back against boundaries. A teenager feels it's his God-given duty when he's given any boundary of any sort. You mustn't go out at night, you mustn't wear this, you mustn't eat that, you mustn't do that, you mustn't do this. As soon as you tell a teenager not to do something, the immediate reaction is he's going to have to try and do it and see what this forbidden fruit is all about. And the whole concept of trying to educate teenagers is tiptoeing around this whole idea of how to somehow give boundaries without, because often giving a boundary is absolutely counterproductive. As soon as you say don't do something, it becomes attractive. If you wouldn't have said anything in the first place, it could even have been, we could speculate and say, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu wouldn't have told Adam not to eat from the Eitz Hadas, he might never have noticed it, or might never have known anything about it. He would have gone about, he would have eaten from all the other trees, and this tree wouldn't have been interesting at all.
We also like to be in control.
Say it a bit louder, Eliane.
Sorry. We also like to be in control of our own lives. And
Yes.
if we are not, if we are restricted, it brings us, how can we deal with that? Because we lose control.
We like to sort of stretch our muscles a little bit and go beyond, and also there is an element, there's certainly a thrill in it, If there's a 60-mile-an-hour speed limit, you want to say, what's it like to drive at 70 miles an hour? You know what I mean? There's a certain thrill to go beyond the boundary, something which is forbidden. Let's see what it tastes like. And that is really, that is something which we see here in the story of Adam and Chava from the very beginning. That they were tested in this field. But okay, let's go back to. I just find this. I personally find this whole area particularly interesting in human psychology. And as I say, anybody who has a lot to do with teenagers knows that this is really the crucial issue. How does one manage with teenagers to tell them not to do something without, by doing so, triggering off in them exactly the opposite of what you wanted to achieve?
Are you suggesting, Rabbi Kimche, are you suggesting that Adam and Chava developmentally were in that developmental phase of their lives where still that temptation of adolescence was still meaningful for them?
Okay, it's a good question. It's a good question. That wasn't really what I had in mind, but something maybe connected to that might be worth thinking about. That's certain. Look, there's no question about it that they were given one boundary and they did break it. That is undeniable, right? They did push back against the one thing they weren't allowed to do. So you have to say that somehow in their makeup, even though they had this supreme knowledge, and they could hear the voice of God, and they could understand all the mitzvahs, and they could understand the Sefer Yetzirah and the Eitz HaChaim and everything, but somewhere along the line, once they were given a boundary, there was something there which the Torah is going to give a name to this. So just incidentally, I mean, I'm saying all this as an introduction to chapter 3. The Torah is going to give a name to this desire to push back against the boundary, and the Torah calls it the Nachash. The Torah calls it the snake, okay? And the snake is the poison, of course. So you have here the great knowledge of Adam and Chava. You have this single restriction forbidding them to do something. And then there is what you might call the bug in the system, right? The bug in the system, the fly in the ointment of this whole beautiful system is the nachash, which we're going to have a look at now in a minute. Now, it's interesting to see in the Ramban that the Ramban brings down two different views about whether man initially was created as a mortal or an immortal being. And he says, in an ideal world, which existed before the chait of the Eitz Hadas, the human being had within him and her a neshama that was so powerful that not only did the neshama exist forever, but the neshama transformed the guf, transformed the body into something eternal, right? This is a Kabbalistic idea of the highest order. You can see, for example, in the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, in his Sefer Derech Hashem and Das Tvunus, speaks about this in some detail, that the neshama has the power to transform material, a material world into an eternal world, right? If the neshama functions fully, it doesn't only itself have an eternal existence, but it can transform the body into an eternal existence as well. We find that, for example, the only example we have really dramatically in the Tanakh is Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu Hanavi, who never dies. Eliyahu Hanavi doesn't die. That's why Eliyahu Hanavi comes back and forth into this world. According to Chazal, he's back and forth all the time, right? Because why it's only Eliyahu Hanavi that comes back and forth? Why not Shmuel Hanavi or Moshe Rabbeinu or anybody else in the Tanakh? But Eliyahu Hanavi is there at the bris, isn't he? And he's there speaking to the Nevi'im, and he's there speaking to the Tanoim and Amoraim even, because he never died. The Psukim speak about Eliyahu Hanavi going to heaven in a chariot, right, with his body and his soul into the Olam HaElyon. But he had reached a madrega that even his physical existence had been transformed into something eternal. But as far as I know, he's the only example in the whole Tanakh of somebody who is described to us as going through that state. Eliyahu Hanavi has this image. Okay, let's go back to the text for a minute. So this is the Ramban. He first tells us Al Das Anshe HaTeva, following science, human being was always mortal, always destined to have a finite life. But Al Das Rabbeinu, he says that's not the case, right? That the look at this language here, Chayfetz Eloki Asher Boi, that spiritual force which is inside the human being, Bo'ez Hayetzira, which he was created with, says the Ramban, Yeh Dovik Botomit, if he allows it to be a constant part of his dveikut, if it's permanently attached to his life, for hu yekayim osa lo'ad, he will then live forever, right? So the idea of an eternal life comes from the power of the neshama. So let's have a look here. The Ramban is giving us, just in 2 or 3 lines of the Ramban, these are important words here of the Ramban, what's going on here with Adam and Chava. V'hayofa be'enai, which is an interesting introduction, really, of the Ramban of this paragraph. Hayofa be'enai, which means I know there are lots of different interpretations of this chapter of the Chumash, but this is what looks right to me, right? You understand that there's a big problem here, right? What exactly happened to Adam and Chava as a result of eating from the Eitz Hadas? So he says, what looks right to me is Ki ha'adam haya oseh b'tivro masher ro'oi la'ases, kafi ha'toledes, that the Adam and Chava were created initially in such a way that they would naturally do what was the correct thing to do. In other words, they naturally, intuitively lived a spiritual life without any Yetzer Hara, without any distractions. Kashe Yasu Hashamayim V'chol Tzavam. Like, for example, the laws of science, the laws of astronomy. The laws of astronomy, the movement of the stars, he says, is not subject to anybody's desire to do them or not do them. It's built in. It's the laws of nature, right? The unchangeable, immutable laws of nature, right? Fire works in a certain way, light works in a certain way, plants work in a certain way. They have no bechira. Poale emes shepulosoi emes. Right? This is a phrase that we use about astronomy, that they are emes in the sense that they're reliable. The laws of nature are reliable and unchanging. Yeshano es tafkido. And their life, the existence of nature is clockwork. It's predictable, right? That's why we can study science and predict nature, and we know exactly how it's going to work. He says, however, they don't have in their lives or in their existence any ahava osina. There's nothing in the lives of the plants or the stars or the moon or the solar system. There's nothing which they like to do or they don't like to do. There's no love or hatred. They are simply ticking over according to the laws of science. So what happened? He says, Upri ha'ilon hazeh. But somehow the fruit of this tree, hoyomolid harotzen v'hachefetz, it amplified inside the human being the state of desire and wanting and love and hate and good and bad. And they should choose for good and for bad. So basically what's happening here is Adam and Chava are going through a transformation from living a pure life, which was pure in the sense that it was connected totally to nature and to God and to each other in a completely harmonious way, right? But what they were lacking was the complications, if you like, of love and hatred, of finding something ugly or beautiful. They were just following an intuitively clear path. And then we come to chapter 3, which we're going to just look at today, and we're going to look at a bit more next week. Chapter 3 gives
could you say all the gamut of emotions was missing? Would they be in a state of happiness, or could they be happy and sad, or all the gamut of emotions missing?
That's a very nice question, Judith. A very, very nice question. No, it really is. It's a question that I've thought of. What really is being said here? In a sense, it looks to me as if what the Ramban is saying, that what we call today the emotional life, right? Being deeply attracted to something or repelled by it, or being made happy by it, or sad, or that emotional life is the subjective element which they didn't have. They didn't have that. They had a grasp of MS, pure MS. And that pure MS was intuitively, absolutely 100% clear to them. And that's what they followed without any deviation, they weren't overly happy about it or sad about it. It's just MS. Let me ask you a question. You know, when you do a mathematical equation and you get the answer, there's nothing particularly to be happy about that answer rather than any other answer. That answer is the correct answer. If it's correct, it's correct. It's nothing to get excited about. It might be exciting that you figured out the correct answer. That's a different question. But the answer itself is not in any way something emotional. It's something clear, right? It's something absolute. But once you get into an area of ethical issues or relationship issues, or what we call the emotional life, so everything in the emotional life is colored all the time by our strong desires and frustrations and our what we find repellent and attractive. So let's have a look how the Nachash does this. The Nachash is the snake. I'd just like to tell you from the very beginning, I'll show you inside maybe next week a bit more in detail, but there are two schools of thought about this snake. I'd like to introduce you to the Nachash, right? Chapter 3 is about this Nachash, this snake. Now, this snake seduces, as we all know the story, the snake convinces Chava to do the Aveira. She takes the fruit, eats it, and gives it to Adam, and he eats it, and that's the disaster. But what is this snake? What is it? So there are two schools of thought about this. You can either understand that Nachash was a real creature in the world, which we're not familiar with today, because as a result of this story, that creature was changed so radically that we can't recognize it anymore. But it could be that the Nachash really was some sort of intelligent being that didn't crawl around on the floor, but actually sort of stood up and had some sort of level of intelligence and was able to speak and communicate with Chava and convince her. In order to accept that picture, you have to accept that the world at that time was a completely different world, right? And the world was really had in it creatures and laws of nature which are just completely incomprehensible to us. But nevertheless, I just want to tell you, there is a school of thought saying that the Nachash was a real being which could speak. Here we are, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, we are in Parshas Balak, and this Shabbos we're going to read about the donkey of Bilam that spoke to him, right? So in Bilam's story, we have a speaking donkey, right? Now, we all understand that the speaking donkey was a miraculous event of some sort, that it was a break with nature. But do we say the same thing about the speaking snake in Bereshis chapter 3 or not? So that's a debate among the Mefarshim. Incidentally, there is a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos which says there were several things created Erev Shabbos Bein Hashmoshes. After God finished creating the world, just during the twilight zone, he created certain things which are a little bit part of the physical world, but not completely. And one of them is the mouth of the donkey, of Bilam's donkey, Pi Ha'oso, right? And that was something, a miraculous creation, semi-physical, semi-spiritual, sort of a twilight, the world of Bein Hashmoshes, the twilight world of all those things which were part of the physical world, but not completely. What's interesting is that in that Mishnah, the Nachash does not appear. It doesn't say that the speaking snake was also something created at that point. So it's clear. So it is possible. Anyhow, I'm now going to tell you the other school of thought is that the speaking snake is actually not meant to be a real being, a real animal in this world, but the Nachash is a metaphor. A metaphor. The Nachash it refers to what we usually refer to as the Yetzer Hara. In other words, the Nachash is a voice inside the human being which says to him, I wonder what that forbidden fruit tastes like. We can't allow ourselves to be denied this forbidden fruit. We must go and taste it. And I'm sure that this forbidden fruit is something absolutely fabulous. So it could, as I say, the Nachash could be, it could be a mashal. What have I got here? Something interesting here. 1 second. So, for example, the Sforno, right? The Sforno, one of the classic commentators, says the Hanachash says he says Hu haSatan, Hu haYetzer Hara. So you can see clearly the Sforno takes the view that the reference to the snake in Bereshis chapter 3 is a reference not to an animal in the garden, but it's a reference to the voice in the head of Chava. Right? And why is he called a snake? He says, because he says, Rav HaHezek imiut hayoso nireh. What does that mean? It means it can do massive damage, even though it's difficult to see. A snake is something which slips through the grass and here for a second and then it goes. But in that second, if it gives you a bite, then that poison can be massively damaging. Now, it's not like a lion, right? Basically, what he's saying is if the Torah wants to find a mashal, a metaphor for the Yetzer Hara, why does it speak about a lion? It says, no, a lion is something you can see and it's massive. The nachash is almost invisible because it slips in and slips away, and some snakes are quite small but quite fatal. So he says, the very interesting language here, Rav hahezek, meaning massive damage, in miutayosa nire. Right? So he says here, ki omnom yikra hadava b'shem eza domela. Often we find in the Tanakh that things are called by a name which is similar to them. So he says, for example, Kamosha Nikra Hamelech Aryeh. Sometimes a king is referred to as a lion. We don't mean, when we say that the king is a lion, we don't mean that he's got claws and teeth like a lion. It means the lion is a metaphor. Amro, as it says, Allah Aryeh Mishchavo Vayikra Ovim. Right. So he says here, Vayikra Ovim Mazikim Nechashim Tzifonim Ashayin Lehem Lachash. He says the dangerous enemies are often referred to as a snake, right? And in English as well, sometimes one uses the idiom, the metaphor of a snake in the grass. A snake in the grass means a hidden danger, which you can't see until it's too late, right? That is the snake. So here we have in chapter 3, which we're going to look at more, please God, either next week or in 2 weeks' time, depending on when I actually get a ticket to fly to London. Still all up in the air at the moment. As I said to you, my original ticket was for this week, but because we have a bris in the family, so I have to a bris of a great grandson. So we're going to delay our trip until early next week, and I haven't yet got a ticket. My travel agent is working on it. If the ticket is on Tuesday, then I can't give the share. But if it's before or after, then I'll do it with Zoom from London. No problem with that at all. One of the advantages. Thank you for your mazel tov wishes. Thank you very much. I wish you all. Oh, somebody makes an interesting connection between the snake here and the snake which was put, the copper snake, which was used as by Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, maybe I'll mention that next time we have a shir. The topic of next shir is going to be the snake. And I'm just giving you an introduction that we have 2 different ways of viewing this snake, either as a real animal who has a real conversation with Eve and really seduces her and convinces her and actually desires her, right? Or we have the nachash simply as a voice in her head which tells her to push back against the boundaries and to try and taste the forbidden fruit. Why does she do it? What motivates her? And above all, why does she then share it with her husband? All this and more we're going to look at in the next shir, Bez Hashem. Nice to see you all, ladies and gentlemen. I have to go.
Rabbi Kimche,
yes.
Why does the verse say, it says that he was the most whatever, Mikol Chayot HaSadeh. So
that's right.
The shot, he was
yes.
there.
Yes, Yudit. There are many reasons to think that there is a pshat here, but it's also a little bit inconceivable, really, that it was a real. We don't know the answer to this question. There is a reason. We'll look at it more in the next year. You're quite right. The text of the Chumash, the pshat in the Chumash seems to be that there was a real animal called a nachash who could really speak, who really convinced Chava, who came to her and actually wanted to destroy her for reasons we're not sure of, and wants to get her to do the wrong thing. However, there are many. I just showed you that a Sephorno says that the nachash is the Yetzer Hara. Okay, so we will look at